This week's edition of Talk Vietnam has taken us to the charming town of Hoi An, where our character spent the last year or so being here working on her new book. However, it's been 22 years since she first arrived in Vietnam, where she has drawn inspiration from the land, the people and the culture for her written works. So what are we waiting for? Let's meet Elka.
A published author, a former journalist and travel writer, our Talk Vietnam guest this week is none other than Elka. She was born in the United Kingdom and grew up in Canada. But a simple backpacker's trip of a high school graduate back in 1992 would see Elka deciding to move to Vietnam on New Year's Eve 1994, eventually spending the next 2 decades here. She started out with journalism, communications, and editing jobs in Hanoi, to developing her writing career in Ho Chi Minh City, and now Hoi An. Her recognition as a novel writer began with the book Hanoi Jane, soon moving on to other mystery, crime, and suspenseful works. Yet Elka is well known for writing fiction for both adults and children. Her children's books with quirky drawings and simple narratives offer insight into Vietnamese culture and history to Vietnamese, expat, and overseas Vietnamese kids.
Hello, anybody home? Hey Elka!
Hey!
How are you doing?
Good. Oh.
Okay, finally get to meet the writer of Hanoi Jane. So, excited for the talk?
Yeah, please come in.
Okay. What a lovely place you've got here, Elka. Now, you've lived in Vietnam for quite a long time now. You spent 9 years in Hanoi and 11 years in Ho Chi Minh City, correct? Yeah?
Yes.
So now Hoi An, why the move?
Well, my children were getting older, and I grew up in Canada. My husband grew up in Australia, which both have a lot of nature. We wanted our kids to be in a more natural environment, so living near the beach seemed ideal.
How about the sort of ancient sort of feel of this town? Do you reckon it plays any part in your decision to move over here?
I think that most visitors who come to Vietnam, Hoi An is their favorite place in Vietnam. It has such a charming small town feel still, and it's so beautiful. So because of that, there's now more and more people coming here, more and more expats living here, which is why the school opened. It's close to Da Nang, which is a great city.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And now let's go to your very first novel. So the first novel that you wrote was Hanoi Jane. What sort of motivated you to write it, and why Hanoi?
So I lived in Hanoi for 9 years. I moved there in the mid-90s. And at that time, I was single, I was young, and I really loved it. Some of my best friends are still from Hanoi. I'd always been writing, but after I had children, I'd been writing more serious fiction, sort of short stories that were quite gloomy and literary. And after I had kids, I was really tired, and I was, I guess, nostalgic for Hanoi and for my life back when I was young and single. So Hanoi Jane is a book about a single woman and the kind of difficulties she encounters.
What sort of role did Hanoi play in terms of the inspiration for your writing there? Did it have anything to do with like the lifestyle of the people, the culture there?
Sure, Hanoi is such a fascinating city. It's got 1,000 years of history. It's so jam-packed with people and culture and color, and it's a great setting for a novel. So the book is about a foreigner. She's American, but she's learning how to survive in a place that's completely alien to her after her life falls apart. And so Hanoi is very much a character in the book.
Speaking of the character in the book, is there some part of yourself in there? Is it sort of, did the character somehow represent your own personal experience?
No, it's fiction. It's the things that happen, the plot, are completely fictional. But I think some of those feelings of culture shock and alienation and being young and not knowing where you fit in. I think those are universal, and Hanoi was a good setting, because that was my experience. It was a good setting for me to portray that.
So it's been quite a long time since the book came out now. Can you go back in time a little bit and remember how your readers first received it, and how did you feel about their feedback?
So I was very surprised, because Hanoi Jane is a very light, I don't want to say silly book, but it's light and fun, and it's not serious at all. And I was amazed that, one, it got published right away, and then that people really enjoyed it, and smart people enjoyed it. So I had people who were lawyers or professionals like doctors and people who I expected to be reading more serious books were reading it and saying that it was fun. It's the kind of thing you'd read on holiday or on a long plane journey. So yeah, I was pleasantly surprised.
What do you think sort of attracted them to this book? What do you think mesmerized them the most?
I think a lot of my readers are people with an interest in traveling, an interest in Asia, an interest in different cultures, and then people who are just looking for what we all look for when we read a book. We look for entertainment and maybe to see the world a bit differently.
And the book was later on translated into Vietnamese, correct?
Yes.
How did the Vietnamese audience sort of receive that book, and how did that make you feel?
So I've gotten quite a few messages and emails from local readers, which is really lovely, and mostly women. It's a book sort of targeted at women, although I did get some messages from guys. But these are Vietnamese women who they read a lot of international books, and they told me they enjoyed reading a book that was like an international book, but in a setting that they really knew and loved.
Do you think that, the Vietnamese translation of your book sort of did the actual story justice, do you reckon?
I have no idea. I think it would, I don't know. My Vietnamese isn't good enough to know, and don't think it would be an easy book to translate, because humor is quite difficult to translate. Things that are funny in one language often just aren't that funny in another language, so we'll see. But people, I had a couple readers who read it in both languages, and no one told me that it was terrible, so hopefully it wasn't.
I haven't plowed so voraciously through a book in a long time, said a reader named Sarah, while expat book reviews wrote about Hanoi Jane. It zips along at a cracking pace with a compelling plot and fun characters. The novel recounts the story of an American woman who has discovered months into moving to Hanoi with her banker fiancé that he is cheating on her. What began as a bid to win back her fiancé soon developed over the chapters into the adventures of Jane's life.
I totally fell in love with the book and the characters, and it took me just back to the time that I lived in Hanoi. But at the same time, I feel like a reader who doesn't live here would also connect, because she describes the cities and the scenes so well. And then, of course, from then I was a little bit addicted to Elka's books.
Elka's close friend, journalist Chen Mai Anh, has known Elka since her first days in Hanoi. She read the first drafts of Hanoi Jane and also accompanied Elka in coming up with the design of the book.
Mình nghĩ không phải là khi mà Elka đặt bút viết là bắt đầu bạn ấy viết sách, mà những ngày bắt đầu ở Việt Nam đó đã bắt đầu hình thành lên một câu chuyện về Việt Nam trong con người của Elka rồi. Những gì Elka viết nó là một phần hiện thực của cuộc sống. Vì những cái góc cạnh nhỏ bé mà Elka viết đấy, những cái góc phố, những con người, những suy nghĩ của những người phụ nữ về đắn đo, day dứt về cuộc sống tâm trạng hàng ngày cũng như tình cảm, đọc ra nó cũng thể hiện được những cái nhịp sống hiện tại của cuộc sống. Thì sẽ rất nhiều người, mình tin, trong cái cuộc sống hiện đại này sẽ tìm thấy là mình đang được mô tả lại, vẽ lại, và cái cuộc sống của mình đang được thể hiện trong những cái tác phẩm của Elka đấy.
Elka's next publications would delve deeper into the crime and suspense genre of novels, with a style of writing that keeps readers like Nadine captivated.
I couldn't put the book down, and I don't think a book gets better than that. If you can't stop reading it, I think that says a lot about the writer and the author. I find her stories very, very easy to read. They're captivating. The stories keep you hooked. So you want to know what happens in the end.
Some of Elka's other prominent works in adult fiction include a short story series called What You Don't Know, Tales of Obsession, Mystery, and Murder in Southeast Asia, as well as a psychological thriller titled Saigon Dark.
Speaking of your first novel again now, was it difficult for you to convince the publishers to publish it, and how did you go about doing so?
So that publisher is called Marshall Cavendish. They're based in the UK. I met the people in their Singapore office. I was very lucky. I sent it out to a couple publishers and it got published right away. So I was surprised, I was surprised.
What do you think sort of made them want to publish the book? What got their interest?
I think that there's a market for, it's a mystery, but it's a very light and romantic mystery. And I think there's a market for that. People want something fun that's a break from their ordinary lives. And it's that kind of book. And it's set in an interesting place that not a lot of international fiction has been set in.
The setting of the book is in Hanoi, in Southeast Asia. Do you think that, these settings would limit your outreach of audiences, do you reckon?
I think they do. All three of my books so far have been set in Southeast Asia. 2 of them in Vietnam, and then I have a book of short stories that was set all over Southeast Asia. I think that it's maybe limiting to some overseas readers who aren't familiar with that area, but then it also is a niche market because a lot of people are interested in that area and they will seek out those books.
And in terms of those people who are interested in the area and the book, do you reckon the exoticness of Southeast Asia, as well as the intrigue that Southeast Asia provides, do you reckon it has a role to play in terms of drawing readers to your books?
I think so. And I think that Southeast Asia, I mostly write crime, so that's, there's always a mystery angle in what I write. And Southeast Asia, or the tropics in general, are a really good setting for crime fiction, sort of the whole overgrown, lush foliage and swampy feel, and it's a good setting for a mystery.
When I first met you, I thought that you were like a really, really warm and welcoming sort of person. You have this really, really warm character of yours. I never pictured you as like an actual crime writer. So why crime as a genre? Why have you chosen this instead of all the others?
So I'm very interested in what motivates people. I've always been really interested in why people do the things they do. And crime fiction, it's how it's called whodunits, but it's not actually, it's why done it. People want to know, when any crime takes place in real life, people want to know who did it, but they want to know why they did it. Like, why would someone do these terrible things? And so that, as a writer, it's about exploring extreme emotions. You don't write about the everyday stuff, right? We all know that. You write about the extremes of human experience. And so for me, crime is really interesting because I get to explore why people do the crazy things they do. I think that it's impossible to not look at the dark side of life as well as the bright side. I really believe in yin and yang. There's 2 sides to everything. And so my fiction explores both sides. Is
the content of this book, is it based on anything you've sort of experienced in real life? Is it based on, your encounters with friends here in the country?
No, not the short stories, no. These are, any little thing though can sometimes grow into something, can grow into a story. For instance, in Saigon Dark, which was my most recently published novel, which is a psychological thriller. It's about a woman who, she basically swaps one child for another child. And that idea came to me when my son was born. He was born in Bangkok, and his passport was issued when he was 3 or 4 days old. And so the photo, you know, he was this little lumpy, bald person that could have been anyone, and that photo was valid for 5 years. So I remember looking at that passport thinking, you know, how can this possibly be his ID when he's 5 years old? Because you could use it for anyone. And that was the idea for the story, grew out of that.
Saigon Dark tells the story of a Vietnamese woman who, in the grief of losing her child, decides to cover up the death and take another child as her own. The decision would haunt her for the next decade as she tries to live a lie. The novel delves into the themes of lies, deceit, grief, and the darker sides that extreme emotions can bring out in people. The book has been reviewed as a, quote, satisfying psychological thriller, and one that is full of raw emotions.
So now your latest fiction book is Saigon Dark, which is supposed to be a lot darker. Do you reckon? So why have you decided to go a lot darker with this new book of yours? And
so Saigon Dark is much darker. It is a mystery. It's psychological suspense. There's a real feeling of sort of foreboding through the whole book. You know things are going to get worse. The book is about grief, and it's about secrets, and it's about how sort of trying to hide the truth can make you crazy. And that sort of my wanting to explore that came from a very sad time in my life when my first daughter died. And so, you know, I have a firsthand experience of grief and wanted to show that in a book. From my experience of grief, the worst thing was trying to act normal, trying to act like I was okay when I wasn't. And so I think that that's really interesting. And to depict a character who's always having to pretend she's okay was really interesting to me.
so what role do you think your writing plays? And, you know, what would your life be like without writing?
Oh, well, I do quit every now and then. You know, I sort of, I write something and it doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't do well, or, and then I sort of get into a snit and say, that's it, you know, I could do other things with my life. But I have this compulsive need to make up stories. You know, I don't understand people who are bored because there's always, if I have the time, there's always a movie going on in my head, you know. And I just feel this need to get those stories out and try to share them with other people.
So how do you keep the creative juice going? How do you get all this inspiration?
So far, that hasn't been a problem. You know, I have a lot of ideas. It's finding the time to get them all out.
And speaking of inspiration, is there a particular author that has inspired you in your work?
You know, I read a lot. I mean, I read across all kinds of genres, and there are some great female crime authors who I really, really admire. You know, old ones like Daphne du Maurier, new ones like Tana French, Denise Mina. There's Donna Tartt, you know, who's more a literary crime. And these new female crime writers, and some older ones, they sort of are blurring the lines between literary fiction and genre fiction or crime writing. So they are using a mystery which is driving the plot forward and making you want to keep turning the pages to find out more. They're using that mystery to teach you more about human nature and life. And I find that really interesting.
So you mentioned earlier that writing is rather challenging at times, and sometimes you wanted to quit. Mm-hmm. What were these challenges?
So writing's very lonely. You know, you're spending 6-8 hours a day, sometimes more, in front of a computer by yourself. You're spending months or years on a project with no feedback. You don't know if it's any good. It might be terrible. You know, it really, and some things just don't go anywhere. Some things are good, but they're not what the market needs or wants, and so they don't get published. Some things, you know, I've had a novel I worked on for years and years and years, and it made it sort of really high up the chain of a huge publisher, and then they rejected it. And it's depressing. So I have those moments where I think, why am I doing this? I could do something else with my life.
So what helped you push through all these hard, challenges, and how did you overcome them?
Ultimately, I just get a new idea for a new story and set off again.
Speaking of the inspirations in Elka's work and style of writing, we get a chance to meet with her writing mentor. And Deborah Newland, known more widely as A.D. Scott, is an internationally noteworthy Scottish novelist and author to 8 publications in the genre of mystery and thriller, literature and fiction. Also based in Hoi An, she has become instrumental in giving Elka feedback in writing and plot building for years.
Elka's writing style is really fresh. She writes great plots. Her stories are always really good. She gives you a very good sense of the place, particularly in the beginning in Hanoi Jane. That really captured not just the life of an expat, but the life of the young Vietnamese.
For Elka, A.D. Scott's extensive works in crime fiction is a great source of inspiration.
Just from reading her novels, I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about how to make things suspenseful. She's really great at developing characters that really come alive and really feel alive and have lots of those little details that real people have. So through that, and also through talking with her, I think I've learned to develop more realistic and more interesting characters.
It's an exchange. She does the same for me, and she reads my work, and she tells me what is working, what is not working, what's clear, and what I need to revise, do more work on. So it's absolutely lovely because it's a very lonely job, and it's great to have an intelligent, educated person who can exchange ideas with you.
Now let's just go a little bit back to your beginning as a writer. How did you sort of develop that love for writing? How did it all start for Elka Ray?
So even as a child, I read a lot. My parents read to me when I was really little. I am an only child, and we moved around all the time. So, I spent a lot of time by myself reading or drawing or had to entertain myself. We often lived in really remote places where there was no TV, there was no electricity. So, I had no choice but to entertain myself. And I think that a lot of what I do comes from that. And then after school, after high school, I spent 6 months backpacking in Southeast Asia, and I really fell in love with it. And so when I went back to university, I studied journalism and Asian studies, and sort of, writing and Asia have remained a focus.
Why did you decide to move to Vietnam at the beginning, and what was it like to first experience Hanoi and the life here in the country?
So I came to Vietnam the very first time in 1992. I was a backpacker. I was on my summer vacation, and I really fell in love with it. It was so different from anywhere else that I'd been. It had been closed off to the outside world for a long, long time. And I found people really welcoming, really resourceful. There was a feeling of sort of curiosity, just on other people's part and on my part. And there's this sense that, things were going to change. And I found that really interesting. And then so after I finished university, I studied Asian studies with a focus on Vietnam, and I came back here for 1 year. My plan was to be here for a year and then to do a PhD. And instead, I got a job and lots of friends and ended up staying.
What was your first impression of the capital city when you first arrived?
So Hanoi in the mid-90s, it was beautiful. It was still quiet. There wasn't very much traffic. People were on bicycles or motorbikes, not a lot of cars. At that time, there was just so much life, you know, packed into a small area. I lived right in the middle of the old quarter, and it was really, really interesting. Every day I saw things that surprised me. So, and even still, you know, even still I go to Hanoi and things still surprise me. Growing up in Canada, Canada is such an empty country. There are so few people, and you can be downtown and you can go for a walk for an hour and you might not see anyone. To suddenly be in the old quarter, which at the time was, I think it was the most heavily congested area in the world, and to just have so many people everywhere, the lack of privacy and the lack of quiet was really hard to adjust to at first. But on the other hand, I found it really interesting to be able to see people living outdoors. You know, all of life takes place outdoors here. And as a writer, that's really interesting.
Having lived here for 20 years now, you must have seen and witnessed the country sort of changing and evolving as well. Has this sort of like change in Vietnam influenced the way you write your books as well?
You know, it's very hard to pull apart influences. I've grown up here. You know, I came here in my early 20s, and it's hard to know how those changes, you know, are they because I've grown up or because Vietnam's changed? It all goes together for me.
In Hoi An, Elka lives with her husband and 2 children on An Bang Beach. Elka's husband, Thiện Nguyen, is a Vietnamese Australian. Their children, therefore, are exposed to a range of different cultures, including Vietnamese, British, Canadian, and Australian. Most of the time, it is Thiện who reviews Elka's first draft writings.
The quality of the proofreading that I'm providing for her, I'm not sure that it's a very high caliber, but you know, I give her, I guess, insight on, I guess, what a general public might perceive her works. I find her work tremendously interesting, very easy to read, and I think most importantly, just fascinating in the depth of the Vietnamese culture.
Elka's son Sol and daughter Ellie are 9 and 8 years old. The children grew up in Ho Chi Minh City, but have since adjusted to their new life in Hoi An.
My favorite things in Hoi An, going surfing, planting lots of plants, having this house, and having a good school. My mommy's hobbies is drawing and writing books. We draw all different kinds of things.
Ellie is a fan of her mommy's new children book, The Warrior Queens, that tells the story of Hai Ba Chung, or the Chung sisters, the heroines of Vietnam that led the rebellion against the Chinese Han Dynasty overlords in the year 40 to 43 AD.
It's about 2 sisters, and they fight against the bad guys, and they win, and then they don't win, and then they win, then they don't win, then they win. And the lesson is to not give up.
The family of 4 consider Vietnam their home and can't imagine living elsewhere.
Elka is probably more Vietnamese than me in that she's lived in Vietnam for many more years than I have. But together, living in Vietnam and raising our children here, I think it's been so special. You know, I really enjoy having them here to be able to, you know, be a part of the Vietnamese community and experiencing some of the culture in Vietnam.
And it was such a great pleasure meeting your family, your loved ones as well. There are many other curious expat parents out there who are wondering what are some of the challenges or opportunities that one might find as an expat parent growing, you know, raising their kids up here in Vietnam.
Well, I think it really depends where you live. Living in a city or living here, which is more rural, is very different. I think that the benefits, Vietnam's really safe in terms of crime, you know, it's super safe. The biggest kind of threat here is traffic. Vietnamese people are generally really welcoming and really nice to kids. So they're very, very kind to small children, and people will take care of your kids if you're in a restaurant or play with them, or you never feel unwelcome as a parent with small kids. There's a lot of tolerance for noise here, which is a good thing when you have little kids. But no, generally I think this is a lucky place for kids. There are a lot of beautiful places for them to explore. They can, I don't know, I just think of like birthday parties my kids went to recently. They got to ride on a water buffalo. I mean, that's pretty fun. Yeah.
Quite an experiment.
Yeah.
Have you ever gone through a scenario where you have to explain the cultural identity, the concept of cultural identity to your kids?
It's definitely complicated for my children. If people ask them where they're from, they say they're from Vietnam, because my daughter was born here, my son was born in Bangkok, but came here, when he was a couple weeks old. So they've spent their whole lives in Vietnam. And they know, of course, that they're also from Canada and from Australia and the UK, because they have a lot of passports. Yeah. So that's complicated for them. But they have friends from all over the world. They have Vietnamese friends, and then they have friends from lots of different places.
How have you been able to balance this sort of cultural differences, this cultural mix that you've got here in the family?
Luckily, I've been in Vietnam such a long time that I think I have a decent understanding of Vietnamese culture by now. And my husband grew up overseas, so he's very Australian. But of course there is still that Vietnamese side to him, and those are great things. Those are great values. Like, he's very family oriented, which I think is a really Vietnamese thing. The problem for us is, where would we ever go if we didn't live in Vietnam?
Where did your passion for your drawing for kids' books come from, and how did it all start for you?
So after I had children, I wanted to, because my husband is originally Vietnamese, and because we lived in Vietnam, I wanted to read them books for small kids about Vietnam. And at least what was available in English was very gloomy. It was all about the war. It was all about, it was just, old. So I saw there was a hole in the market. So I decided to make some very simple books with cute, colorful illustrations that would sort of show contemporary Vietnam for kids, for toddlers. And it worked. They sell.
A for outside, or W for water buffaloes. A vendor selling kites to food stalls on the streets. Elka's children books are a compilation of fun illustrations and simple snippets of Vietnamese life. Some of her well-known works for young ones include Vietnam A to Z, Vietnam 1, 2, 3, or The Warrior Queens. Today, Elka is visiting the Green Shoots International School in Hoi An to have a reading session with the little ones here.
Something you guys see in Vietnam a lot. M is for motorbikes.
I think that the children can really relate to Elka's books because living in Vietnam, whether they're from the Vietnamese background or foreign background, they can look at the pictures and they can see many things from their life, like the lanterns or the motorbikes. And when children are interested in books, it makes them want to read and find a love of learning and reading.
For an international classroom like this, Elka's books are among the still quite limited selection of bilingual books on Vietnamese culture for young kindergarten-age children. The young readers love making links between what they see in the books and what they've experienced in real life.
I'm just going to show you something that I know. Where's the picture of Gao does this?
Gao does this, gets his hair cut.
Outside.
On the street. Elka's books are a lovely addition to our Vietnamese cultural studies that we do with all of our students here at Green Shoots. living in Vietnam, we teach the children that this is their host country and it's important to understand the culture. So books like Elka's allow us to introduce that element to the youngest students, which is just wonderful.
I want Miss Elka to make a lot of food books and a lot of picnic books for me.
What sort of food do you think Miss Elka could put in a Vietnamese food book?
I like dum dum.
Alongside books, Elka's illustrations have been used to create souvenir products, including cards and magnets. The gifts are sold alongside the books within an initiative started by Elka and her close friend Mayang called My Guppy. The proceeds from the sales help support children in need of genital reconstruction, as well as other kids from disadvantaged background through the Asia Injury Prevention Foundation and the Thiện Nhân and Friends program. For Mayang, Elka's depictions of Vietnam are fresh and are always full of optimism.
Mình thích Elka rất thích ở một điểm và thực sự đấy là mình cũng bị ảnh hưởng của một người bạn này rất là một điểm là trong mọi tình huống bạn ấy đều nhìn thấy những cái khía cạnh lấp lánh của cuộc sống, như những cái bức tranh hoặc những câu chuyện Elka viết về những con người sống lam lũ hoặc những cảnh ăn uống hoặc những khu chợ của Việt Nam, những con người Việt Nam gồng gánh đều nhìn thấy cái nỗi vất vả trong đấy nhưng mà là một những bức tranh và những cái ký họa rất là đẹp.
With Elka's recent children's book, The Warrior Queens on the Chung sisters, she looks to creating more illustrations and novels that share with children the heroic history of Vietnam.
And what sort of message or what sort of education would you like to deliver through these creations of yours to the expat kids, the kids who read your books, and your own kids as well?
Kids love to have their own reality sort of reflected. They like to read books that they recognize people who look like them or, places that are familiar. And I wanted these books to be read by foreign kids in Vietnam, but by Vietnamese kids, because there was nothing like that. And especially overseas Vietnamese. There are a lot of overseas Vietnamese, and now they've had children, and a lot of those children have never been to Vietnam. They don't know anything about Vietnam. And so I wanted a way for those overseas Vietnamese parents and grandparents to be able to read these really simple books that are teaching those little kids about their homeland.
In terms of the future now, what do you think the future holds for your writings? And do you have any books in plan you're planning at the moment?
Yeah, so I'm about 100 pages into the first draft of a new novel. And that is also suspense, and that one's set overseas. That one is set near where I grew up in Canada. First draft is pretty rough. You don't really know what will happen, but it's about a woman who, she moves from the city to a small island with her husband, and they buy an old house, and they renovate this old house. And it turns out that there's, a sort of a very dark secret associated with this house, which she slowly discovers, and her husband.
I can see that it actually has taken some inspiration from your move to your new house.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay. And it's been 20 years now. Mm-hmm. What do you think has kept you here for so long? What do you think is so mesmerizing about Vietnam, its people and its culture?
Definitely the first 10 years, I stayed here because it was very, very interesting. At that time, Vietnam was just changing so much, and I felt really lucky to see those changes. And then I met my husband. He has, his work is here. We had kids here, then it became sort of more just about a practical place to live.
Well, thank you very much. I've had an interesting talk, and I can't wait to read your next book and, find traces of your new home in that little book as well. And that has wrapped up this edition of Talk Vietnam. We hope that you enjoyed our little talk, our little session, and learned a bit more about what it's like to be an expat writer in Vietnam, as well as being an expat parent as well. Goodbye for now, and until next time, I'm Michael Liu.